What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with DC
KO!
And here's the thing. This is the Superman tie-in. This has a lot of tie-ins to it. So, what this does is this picks up with the Man of Steel flying back to Krypton before the fight that takes place that basically determines who the champions of Earth are going to be, so to speak, right? These individuals that have to compete against one another to determine who is going to be the being that will essentially face off against Darkseid, right? Now, presumably, that individual will be able to choose their team to face off against Darkseid's forces from the absolute universe. And so what happens is Superman basically kind of talks to Kelex for a little bit, right? The fact that the fortress is being restored. But his main reason for being here is to talk to his father. And this is one of the coolest things about the lore of Kryptonians in DC Comics. Not that Superman can talk to his dad, but what comes out of it, right? Because he says, "Father, I do not have a lot of time, but I have questions about Krypton." And that's when his father says, that is why this simulation was provided, why I placed our world's files in your rocket. And so Superman asks, what do those files have on Darkseid? And his father's response, there is no knowledge of Darkseid in our records. Now, off the cuff, that seems crazy, right? It seems nonsensical. How could Kryptonians not know about Darkseid? But this is not something that's simply just being made up, right? This is not Joshua Williamson pulling something out of his backside. There's two main stories that illustrate that Kryptonians seemingly don't know about Darkseid and that Darkseid didn't care about Kryptonians until Superman. The first one of those is a 4-issue miniseries called The World of Krypton from back in 1988. It runs over Krypton's knowledge, its history, and at no point does it make any reference to Krypton knowing about Darkseid. The second story is Batman Superman, The Girl from Krypton, written by Jeff Lowe back in 2004. That's the reintroduction of Kara Zor-El into DC Comics as Supergirl. After Crisis on Infinite Earths, leading up until that moment, every depiction of Supergirl was a non-Kryptonian because DC was trying to maintain the idea that Superman was the sole survivor of Krypton. But during that story, Darkseid goes after Kara, and that's when you end up learning that because of Superman, Darkseid now has an interest in Kryptonians. So putting those two things together, it lines up perfectly with what Williamson is doing here. But that's where Superman asks, what about a King Omega? Seemingly what Darkseid is. And the response of his father, there is no knowledge of King Omega in our records. And so Superman asks, is it possible that not all Kryptonian history was within the rocket? And here's a really cool thing that goes on here, because what Joshua Williamson does is he opens the door to basically changing decades of history when it comes to Superman's knowledge of his own people and their knowledge of the universe in which they resided, potentially even the multiverse. Because what Jor-El says here is some information was deemed illegal, and there are pieces of history that were never transcribed, memories that were passed down from generation to generation, ancestral knowledge, life stories that did not need to be filed, but that was all lost when Krypton was destroyed. What this means is that now Williamson has set it up so virtually any writer in DC Comics who handles Superman, whether it's himself or anyone who comes after, has carte blanche to basically start introducing all these long-lost elements of Kryptonian lore that we just never knew about before. And it's really cool to see it, right? Little lines like this, little moments like this, change everything when it comes to comics. The idea is sound. We just hope the execution will be when whoever it is that changes those things comes along and does it, right? And so Superman responds to this and he says, I know you're not really you. You're just a simulation the rocket provided to give me history and comfort. So I'll understand if you really cannot answer this question, but why did you only save me? And the response of his father, because your mother and I love you and wished to save you. Of course, then he asks the next most logical question. What about a larger shuttle? And his father says space travel had been illegal on Krypton for generations. Knowledge from outside our world was forbidden. Because of this, I was forced to build your rocket with limited resources and in secret. And so Superman asks, right, but what if you had unlimited resources? And he simply says, I have no knowledge of that, because he's asking a simulation to answer a question that it couldn't possibly answer because it can't really think for itself in that way. And so he says, Father, if you could have help and resources and the ability to build more shuttles, what would you have done? And he simply says, I would have saved everyone. And the response of Superman, that's exactly what I needed to hear. And so at that point, he races off to LexCorp. Now, LexCorp used to be Supercorp, right? The idea behind LexCorp is that basically it was kind of handed over to Superman by Lex Luthor, and then Superman was using all of its resources in order to build out, quite literally, a Supercorp, a kind of coming together of various individuals under the Superman mantle. So think of it as like Superman's version of Batman Incorporated, if you guys are familiar with that from Grant Morrison. And where initially you do get a little bit of catching up with Rudy, right? A guy who just absorbs energy. He absorbs some energy from Doomsday and has just satiated him in a way that he couldn't possibly imagine, right? You or I going to a Chinese buffet, right? That what Superman is really here for is to talk to Marcy, because Marcy makes reference about the idea of apocalyptic fire pits that are erupting around Earth. Now, one of the things that DCKO and the lead up to DCKO revealed is that there is essentially a Heart of Apokolips in Earth, that Earth would be turned into a new apocalypse. And that's part of the reason why this whole tournament is being held in the first place. And so Superman asks, right, what do you know? And she simply says, Supercore, or at least LexCorp scientists have picked up fluctuations at the Earth's core. Something big is down there, and it's something powerful. And she just says, follow me, right? And she says, you may have cut LexCorp off from JLU Communications, but we have our ways. We know the Justice League has been active, working with the Titans, preparing some sort of mass evacuation. So we got to work ourselves. We call it the super ship. This is kind of cool, right? I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that it is Joshua Williamson taking a page out of Jonathan Hickman's Collapse of the Multiverse. It's really just the most logical thing for them to do, because she says, Supercorp was developing it before you left us. The idea was to take our scientists to the stars, that we've been studying Brainiac's bottle technology and how he makes the most of the constraints of physical space. We can put a whole city inside one super ship, maybe even an entire country. We can quite literally evacuate the entire world. And so that's where Superman says, awesome, we need 12. And she's kind of flabbergasted, right? She's like, what in the world is going on? And so that's the interesting thing, because at that point, you switch over to Superman meeting with Lois Lane. Now, here's the thing, right? You guys know Lois. I know Lois. We all love Lois Lane, right? She is the first lady of comics, right? There's no arguing that. That's just the way that it is. And so Superman is literally trying to bargain with her to a degree and explaining what's going on, right? He says, it's the only way. And even Supergirl says, I know that all of this sounds crazy, Lois, right? A fight tournament to save the world is kind of nuts. And I can't believe that I'm gonna say this, but after what the Time Trappers showed us about the future, I believe him. And that's the thing, right? Lois Lane's job, both as a partner to Superman as well as a reporter, is to ask the questions he wouldn't think to ask and to confront him about things that he may deem to be uncomfortable. And that's why she says, Old Man Doomsday, right? The guy who killed you. You trust him. She's like, this is what he wanted all along, for all of you to go along with some insane plan that he had. But here's the thing. It's not just the words of like some crazed ass villain who killed Superman once upon a time, right? Who's just showing up with these words of caution, right? You know, the world's going to end. You guys have to fight in this tournament. You have to believe me, right? That's not what's going on at all. He showed them what's happening. He showed them what awaits them. And so with their own eyes and seeing all this evidence, they're confronted with the reality of it. And so Superman simply says, John Henry Irons and Steelworks are working with Mercy to put together evacuation shuttles. John is already with the Titans to help coordinate the major population centers. And the Justice League is training. And so Lois hears all of this and she's like, you're planning to lose. And the response of Superman is, I'm not planning to lose, right? I'm just accepting the fact that we could. And it's his job to do that, right? I mean, sure, it would be nice to be in a world where Superman will just save everyone from every threat ever, no matter how dangerous that threat may be. But the reality is that this is not just Superman and Lois anymore, right? It's Superman, Lois, their child, it's a whole world. And so Superman is like, we could lose, right? And if I do, I need to make sure that you are safe. And the response of Lois is, it can't just be me. You cannot strictly focus on keeping me safe. And that's where Superman says, I know, we're going to try to save everybody, literally every single human being on the face of the earth. And And so in that moment, and probably the least opportune moment ever, or maybe the most opportune, Jonathan and Martha show up, right? His parents just appear for a surprise visit, right? And Superman's kind of like, it's great you're here because I can basically tell you that we're evacuating the world. And don't worry, you guys are 100% on the list, right? And so, of course, the goal is to spend a little bit of time together, not really because he's saying goodbye. He's just basically accepting the fact that he may very well lose here. And in fact, that's what he talks to Lois about when they're kind of spending time together, is he says, I'm bringing my Dawn's Day knuckles, which of course we saw in the actual DC KO one-shot comic. And Lois tells him, right, don't make jokes. She says, I'm worried, Clark. This is exactly what Time Trapper warned us about. Now that's true. One of the things that happened when Time Trapper showed up previously, right, he told them, yes, I am Doomsday, but I have survived into the far-flung future. And as I've died, I've grown. And as I've grown, I've learned that there's far more to this existence than just trying to kill everything that exists out there. And of course, he's also grown smarter as time went on. And the idea was that he was trying to get Superman and Lois to engage in a series of actions, right? Campaigns on his behalf, which they refused to do. The warning he gave them is that if you take this path of denying my advice, ignoring me, and going down your own road, then you have to know there will be consequences. The things that will come for you will break you on the most personal level, will destroy everything you know and love. This is that warning coming to fruition, and it's only the beginning, right? And so that's where Superman simply says, Mercy is taking care of the Doomsday and Radiant bottled city, taking it with her. Maybe she can use them to navigate Doomsday's past. And again, Lois says, I still don't trust Mercy, right? I'll keep an eye on her, but I just wish there was another way, something that did not involve Time Trapper or Doomsday. And so Superman simply says, I saw Jor-El at the fortress, and I asked him if they had any knowledge of Darkseid or this King Omega in Krypton's archives. And he simply says, he said they had no record of it because knowledge from outside the planet Krypton was illegal. And so when Lois hears that, it sets off a few alarms, right? She's like, of course he said that, right? And Superman's like, I can do this, right? This tournament, I can do this whole thing, but not if I'm preoccupied with everyone here. Not if there's a part of me that's focused on anything else. I need to be 100% focused on that and nothing else. And the only way to do that is to make sure that you and everyone here are in a safe place. And so once the evacuations start, right, Mercy's kind of taking a head count. There's millions of people, right, on these ships that are just being evacuated from this whole place. It's absolutely insane. But then she realizes Lois's ship is gone, right? That Lois is like, I'll be back as soon as I possibly can, and I will be there in time for takeoff. But understand, there's something that I need to look into first. Lois travels to the Fortress of Solitude. And this is where things get really, really cool. Because at that point, Jor-El addresses her, right? The bride of Kal-El. And Lois, as you guys know, pulls no punches, right? And she just says, here's the thing, Jor-El, right? You don't know this, but you and I spent some time together in space. We had a little adventure, you and me and John. And you know what I learned on that trip? You cannot be trusted. You or some crappy simulation version of you. Of course, referring to Brian Michael Bendis' run on Superman, which we all just like to pretend didn't really happen. And she says, I'm not here to ask for your help. I'm here to interview you. So tell me about Darkseid and the Heart of Apokolips. And he just simply says, there is no knowledge of Darkseid or of the Heart. And she's like, yeah, I know, right? In your archives. But when you're a reporter, you learn that finding out what is missing can help lead you in the right direction. Certain bits of information were illegal on Krypton. I get it. But where are the records on what was illegal? You had to know what was illegal in order to forbid it, correct? And that's where he just kind of repeats, right? There is no record. And she's like, your son right now is in the fight of his life, frankly doing what you couldn't do, saving his world. You must know something, anything about the Heart of Apokolips. You have to help him. And where he keeps on saying, right, there is no knowledge in our records, his statement finally shifts. And he says, there is no knowledge in my records. And then in that moment, the personality of Jor-El shifts off and the personality of Lara takes over. And at that point, she just says, when we sent Kal-El away, we hoped that he would find happiness, safety, and of course build a gigantic harem. And she says, I hoped that we would find you. And where Lois is kind of flabbergasted by this, right? She's like, we've never talked before. I've never had a conversation with you. The reality here is that it's a conversation between a mother and the wife of her son. So that is not a conversation that is ever taken lightly. And that's where Laura says, your questions triggered my program, my own memories tucked away within the fortress. My role on Krypton was as a historian. I worked on crafting the archives that were included in my son's shuttle. And while there are no records of a Darkseid, all the worlds Krypton encountered had a legend about a destroyer, the end of all things, a dark Omega presence that wanted to control all, the final god. Our scientists hope to create a champion to stop him, to change the future. But for there to be an Omega, there must be an Alpha. And I believe Doomsday was created to be that. His powers of recreation and rebirth are in direct opposition to everything the King Omega is. This is a huge thing in this comic because Joshua Williamson just retconned the entire reason for Doomsday's creation in DC Comics. And I gotta be honest with you guys, man, I love it. I love the idea that Doomsday was created to basically be the antithesis to Darkseid, and that if his true purpose was to destroy Darkseid, right, to be that everything that Darkseid stands against, then him killing Superman, the fight with Superman, demolishing the Justice League and Bloodwind back in the early 1990s, it was just kind of a bump along the way. Training wheels to becoming the thing that he was going to be. Now, those are some significant training wheels, and those are some big humps he ran over. But at the end of the day, I love the idea that Doomsday's role, his reason for creation, was to be the antithesis of Darkseid. It's phenomenal. I love that. Like, let me know down in the comments if you guys dig it, right? But I love that idea. And so that's where Lois just says Doomsday is the Alpha. Clark has to know, right? But he needs to talk to you. And how the hell am I going to get to him? But in the middle of all that, somebody comes crashing down into the Fortress of Solitude. Of course, Lois goes running to him, Clark, are you okay? Only to find out it's not Clark. It's Superboy Prime, right? It's Superboy Prime. He's arrived back here in the main DC universe. And she's just like, Superman said that you were stuck in the future. And he's like, I was, right? I managed to hold Darkseid's army off, but they were too many, right? Of course, referring to the Absolute Universe's Legion of Superheroes. And he just says, I know what happened to the rest of the legions. All of the legions, but I have to tell Superman now. And the response of Lois, like, do you not know, right? Like, I need to talk to him too, but he's gone and I have no way to reach him. But in the midst of that, there's a massive explosion that's set off when Dirk shows up, right? Starboy. Now, here's the crazy thing about Dirk. Here's the kicker about Dirk. Dirk is incredibly powerful, manipulating solar energy, but the chief ability of his manipulation powers is solar manipulation, specifically yellow sun radiation. And so when he goes on the attack, he says, nice try, Superboy, but we know Superman and the Justice League are trying to capture the Heart of Apokolips. Darkseid is coming, and we, the Absolute Universe, have already won. They left you to die. And that's where Superboy Prime just says, well, then I'll stop you, son boy, right? And he's just like, how, right? You're all alone. No one can save you. And that's where Prime says, there was something that you forgot about. And Dirk is just like, what's that? And Superboy Prime just says, last page reveal, right? Because he knows he's in a comic book. And Dirk is like, what are you smiling about? And then at that point, you have Lois floating through the air. And Prime just says, you blasted her with your sun powers, yellow sun radiation. 6 issues ago, she lost her powers, right? Well, didn't really lose them. They basically just went dormant. She burned them out. And now she's got them back. Superwoman has returned, ladies and gentlemen. And I gotta tell you, I love it because I feel like Superwoman was one of the greatest things in the Superman comic that just never got explored. Thank you, Joshua Williamson. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, and I will catch you all later. Peace.